The first thing I remember noticing was how loud my own breathing sounded in my ears. Not because I was tired, not because I was scared, at least not yet. It was loud because everything else had gone quiet. I'd been still hunting since before dawn, moving slow through the Shenandoah backcountry, one careful step at a time, the rifle balanced against my shoulder like an extension of my spine. November had already stripped most of the color out of the mountains. The forest was a palette of browns and grays, wet leaves plastered to the ground, bare branches clawing at the sky, fog hanging low in the hollows like breath caught between thoughts. This was my third morning out there. I knew the rhythm of this place. I trusted it. The wind had been steady all morning, drifting downhill like it should, carrying my scent away from the ridges where the deer liked to bed. Birds had been hopping and calling. Squirrels had scolded me twice already for passing too close. That's how you know you're not alone out there, but also how you know things are normal. Then, somewhere between one step and the next, it all stopped. No warning, no gradual fading, just absence. The leaves didn't crunch anymore. The breeze that had been lifting the fog off the ground vanished so completely it felt like someone had sealed the forest inside a jar. The chickadees went silent mid-call. Even the distant hum of Skyline Drive, something you could usually feel more than hear, disappeared. I froze with one boot half raised, my muscles locked in place, listening so hard it felt like my ears were burning. Hunters talk about the quiet like it's a sign. Sometimes it is. A predator moves through and everything else takes notice. I'd felt it before, right before a bear crossed my path in Montana, right before a mountain lion screamed somewhere I couldn't see in New Mexico. But this was different. Those moments still had texture, a tension you could trace to something physical. This quiet felt hollow. I lowered my foot slowly, easing my weight onto the ground, and waited for the forest to correct itself, for a bird to chirp, for wind to slide through the branches, for anything to remind me that this was still Shenandoah, still Virginia, still a place governed by rules I understood. Nothing happened. My pulse started to creep up, not from fear yet, but from confusion, the kind that makes you start inventorying yourself. I checked my hands, checked the safety on the rifle, listened to my own breath again and forced it slower. You're projecting, I told myself. You're tired. Third day, bad sleep, too much coffee. That's when I heard it. My name, soft, almost careful. Not shouted, not carried by echo. Spoken. It came from uphill, somewhere beyond the rise ahead of me, where the trail bent out of sight and climbed toward a rocky overlook. The sound slid through the trees like it knew the path already. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mouth went dry so fast my tongue stuck to the roof of it. My chest tightened, not in panic, but in a deep, instinctive refusal. Every part of me understood something my brain hadn't caught up to yet. No one should have been up there. I'd checked in with the ranger station before heading out. I knew who was hunting which zones. I knew how far I was from the nearest access point. There were no trails above me that would make sense for another hunter to be moving downhill unseen. And even if there were, hunters don't whisper names into the woods. I waited. The silence held. Then my name came again. Clearer this time. Closer. It sounded wrong in a way I couldn't immediately describe. The voice had my cadence, my inflection. The way my sister used to call me when we were kids and she needed something. Familiar enough to pull at me, off enough to make my stomach twist. I finally forced myself to move, pivoting my body inch by inch until the rifle came up, pointed toward the slope. "Hello?" I said, hating how small my voice sounded. The word didn't travel. It felt like it fell straight to the ground. I waited for an answer. What I got instead was movement, not footsteps, not branches snapping, something shifting weight uphill just out of sight like someone leaning forward to listen better. My heart started pounding hard enough that I worried it would give me away. If whoever or whatever was up there needed confirmation I was real. A rational explanation tried to surface. Someone playing a joke, a hiker who knew me somehow, a hunter who'd mistaken me for someone else and was now embarrassed enough to stay quiet. Each explanation collapsed under its own weight before it fully formed. I took a step back, then another, careful not to break the rhythm of the forest any more than it already was. The ground sloped unevenly behind me, rocks hidden under leaves waiting to turn an ankle. The voice came again. This time, it didn't say my name. It said, "You can come up now." That was when fear finally arrived. Not a spike, not panic. A slow, spreading cold that started in my chest and moved outward, filling spaces I didn't know existed. The words carried expectation, confidence, like whatever was up there knew I'd been deciding whether or not to move and was tired of waiting. I shook my head once, hard, as if that could dislodge the sound from my skull. "No," I said. The forest stayed silent, but I felt something change. Pressure. Attention. I started backing downhill faster now, my eyes never leaving the rise, my finger resting just outside the trigger guard, hovering between restraint and desperation. That's when the sounds came back, all at once. Birds exploded into the air from the trees around me. Leaves rustled violently as if the wind had been holding its breath and finally let go. Somewhere to my left, something large crashed through undergrowth, moving fast and heavy. The sudden noise should have been comforting. Instead, it felt like chaos unleashed to cover something else's movement. I turned and ran, not blindly, not screaming, but fast enough that caution burned away and instinct took over. Branches tore at my jacket, roots grabbed at my boots, my lungs started to ache as cold air tore in and out of them. Behind me, I heard footsteps, matching mine, too close, too steady. I veered off the slope, cutting sideways through a stand of young trees, hoping to lose whoever or whatever was following me. The footsteps followed, adjusting without hesitation, never stumbling, never lagging. I risked a glance over my shoulder. I saw movement, a shape between trunks, upright, human-sized, but wrong. Its gait was just slightly off, like it was remembering how legs worked instead of using them naturally, and where its face should have been, there was only shadow, even as it passed through patches of light. It spoke again, this time from behind me. "Don't run." My legs nearly gave out. The voice wasn't whispering anymore. It wasn't trying to sound like me. It was layered, like two people speaking at once, one just a fraction of a second behind the other. I screamed then. A raw animal sound ripped out of me without permission. I burst through the last line of trees and stumbled into a shallow ravine, sliding down wet leaves and mud until I hit the bottom hard enough to knock the wind out of me. I rolled, scrambling to my knees, rifle coming up, and there was nothing there. The forest looked normal again, too normal. Sunlight filtered through branches, birds called from the canopy, the wind sighed through dead leaves like it always had. No footsteps, no shape, no voice. I stayed there for a long time, shaking, my back against the ravine wall, the rifle braced across my knees, waiting for something to break the illusion. Nothing did. Eventually, I forced myself to stand and move, slow this time, deliberate, following the ravine downhill until it fed into a wider trail I recognized. I didn't stop until I reached my truck. I didn't hunt again that season. Sometimes, late at night, when everything goes quiet in my house, I think about that voice, about how it knew my name, about how confident it sounded that I would come when called, and I wonder how many times in places like that, people do. The cold came first, not as a shock, but as a pressure, a steady weight that settled into my lungs with every breath. October in the San Juans doesn't announce itself with drama. It just tightens the air, dulls sound, and makes the forest feel watchful. I remember thinking that morning how quiet it was, too quiet for a place that should have been alive with elk movement. No bugles, no distant cracking of branches, just my boots pressing frost into the ground and the soft rasp of my own breathing inside my hood. I'd been hunting alone for 3 days by then. That wasn't unusual for me. I trusted my routines, my maps, my instincts, or at least I told myself I did. The truth was more complicated. I'd come out there with something to prove, to myself, maybe to the memory of hunts that had gone wrong before. I told myself solitude sharpened the senses. I told myself fear was just another tool to manage. The tracks were fresh. That was the first thing that caught my attention. Elk sign cuts through the noise of the forest if you know what to look for. The deep, oval press of hooves, the scuffed earth where they pivot, the snapped stems at chest height. These were good tracks, recent, purposeful. I followed them downhill, moving slow, every step measured. The forest floor was damp with melt, pine needles slick underfoot. Somewhere above me, wind whispered through dead branches, but it sounded distant, like it belonged to another place entirely. As I moved, a sense of unease crept in, subtle at first. Not fear. More like a hesitation I couldn't name. The tracks didn't wander the way elk usually do when grazing. They were straight, deliberate. That made me quicken my pace, heart lifting with the possibility of a clean shot before noon. I adjusted my rifle strap, feeling the familiar comfort of its weight against my shoulder. Then the tracks changed. At first, I thought I was misreading them. The ground here was muddier, the impressions less defined. I crouched, brushing aside loose needles with my glove. The hoof prints narrowed, the edges softened. I told myself it was erosion, overlap, maybe another animal crossing the trail. I stood and took a few more steps, eyes scanning ahead. Another print. Clearer this time. Bare. 5 toes pressed into the mud, the arch visible, heels sunk deep as if the person had put their full weight down. No boot tread, no sock pattern, just skin against earth. I laughed under my breath, a short, dismissive sound that vanished immediately into the trees. People do strange things, I told myself. Hunters lose boots. Hikers wander off trail. Maybe someone had stripped down to cross a creek. The rational explanations came easily, lining up in my mind like soldiers. I clung to them because the alternative, because the way my stomach tightened when I really looked at that print, wasn't something I wanted to entertain. I followed anyway. The forest began to feel narrower, though the trees hadn't changed. Spruce and fir crowded closer, their lower branches sagging like heavy arms. The light dimmed, filtered through thick cloud cover that made it hard to tell the time. My ears strained for sound. Bird calls, wind, anything. But the quiet had thickened, pressing in from all sides. The tracks alternated now. Hoof. Barefoot. Hoof. Barefoot. As if 2 beings had been walking together, one shedding its shape with every step. My pulse ticked louder in my ears, each beat sharp and intrusive. I slowed down, my movements cautious, deliberate. Every instinct I had was whispering that this wasn't right, but I kept arguing with myself, telling myself fear was just fatigue, hunger, the isolation playing tricks. I called out once, just a word. Hello. It felt wrong the moment it left my mouth. The sound didn't travel the way it should have. It seemed to drop, swallowed by the ground, leaving the air heavier than before. No response came back. Not even an echo. The tracks led me toward a rock face I hadn't noticed on the map. It rose abruptly from the slope, a sheer wall of dark stone streaked with mineral stains like old tears. Moss clung to its lower edges, thick and damp, and the air around it felt colder, sharper. The elk tracks stopped 10 yards out. The barefoot prints continued. They approached the rock face in a straight line, toes pointed forward, steps evenly spaced. I counted them without meaning to. 1, 2, 3. They ended inches from the stone. There was no sign of climbing, no scuffed hands, no broken moss, just the last print, heel pressed deep, toes splayed slightly as if the person had leaned forward. Into the rock. I stood there longer than I should have. My mind raced through explanations, hidden crevice, overhang, trick of perspective, but none of them fit. The wall was solid, unbroken. I pressed my palm against it, half expecting it to be warm or soft or wrong in some way. It was cold and unyielding, the chill biting through my glove. That was when I heard it. A sound so faint at first I almost dismissed it as blood rushing in my ears. A low, rhythmic noise like breath forced through clenched teeth. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I turned slowly, scanning the trees, my rifle rising without conscious thought. The sound deepened, took on a wet quality. A dragging inhale, followed by a pause that stretched too long, then an exhale that trembled, almost like a sob. Panic bloomed fast, hot and overwhelming. My rationalizations shattered under the weight of that sound, under the certainty that whatever was making it was close. Too close. I backed away from the rock face, boots sliding slightly on the damp ground. My heart hammered so hard it made my vision blur at the edges. The forest answered my movement with a shift of its own. Branches creaked. Somewhere behind me, something stepped. Not the light, scattered movement of an animal, but a deliberate placement of weight, heel to toe. Barefoot. I spun, rifle raised, breath coming in ragged gasps. The trees stood empty, their shadows stretching and warping as clouds moved overhead. The breathing stopped. Silence crashed down, heavier than before. I wanted to run. Every cell in my body screamed for it. But fear had locked me in place, pinned me between the rock face and the unseen thing behind me. I thought about past hunts, about the times I'd ignored that first flicker of instinct and paid for it. I thought about how easy it was to tell yourself you were being foolish, how dangerous that habit could be. The breathing started again, closer now, unmistakable. I could hear the strain in it, the effort. It sounded human, and that terrified me more than anything else could have. Humans don't belong out there like that. Not without boots. Not breathing like they're learning how for the first time. I broke. I turned and ran uphill, lungs burning, branches whipping at my face and arms. The forest seemed to twist around me, slopes steeper than they'd been moments before, roots grabbing at my boots. Behind me, the breathing kept pace. I could hear footsteps now, soft but relentless, never quite catching up, never falling behind. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I focused on the ground ahead, on not falling, on keeping my legs moving, even as terror threatened to unravel me. My mind fixated on one thought: get back to camp. Get to something familiar, something human. When I finally burst into the clearing where I'd set up, I nearly collapsed. My tent stood exactly where I'd left it, bright against the gray forest, the sight of it flooding me with desperate relief. I dove inside, fumbling with the zipper, hands shaking so badly I could barely close it. The breathing stopped the moment the zipper sealed. I sat there for hours, rifle across my lap, listening. The forest slowly returned to itself. Wind, distant bird calls, the creak of trees. No footsteps, no breath. When night fell, I didn't light a fire. I didn't sleep. I waited for dawn with my back against the tent wall, every nerve stretched thin. I left at first light, packed in silence, moving with the brittle calm of someone who knows better than to draw attention. I didn't go back the way I'd come. I didn't look for the tracks. I just walked until the forest thinned and the world felt real again. I still think about that rock face, about the prints that ended there and the sound that followed me when I turned away. I don't tell myself stories anymore about bravery or toughness. The forest doesn't care about those things. It listens, it remembers, and sometimes it answers in ways you can't unhear. During turkey season in Mark Twain National Forest, Missouri, April 2020, I fired once. Seconds later, the exact same shot echoed back from the opposite direction. Too perfect to be an echo. The forest was already awake before I was. Not with birdsong or wind, but with that low, breathing quiet that only exists before sunrise, when the world hasn't decided yet whether it's going to let you pass through unharmed. The air smelled like damp leaves and cold dirt, and every breath felt heavier than the last, as if the trees were slowly leaning in to listen. I'd been hunting turkeys for most of my adult life, enough seasons to know the difference between a normal morning and one that felt tilted. This one felt tilted from the moment I parked the truck and shut the door too softly, even though no one was around to hear it. The sounds still seemed to travel too far, bouncing off trunks and ridges, coming back thinner, altered. April 2020. Everything in the world already felt wrong that year, and maybe that's why I told myself I was imagining it. I slung my shotgun over my shoulder, checked my calls, and stepped into Mark Twain National Forest the way I always had, confident, alert, pretending my instincts were just nerves. The woods were wet from rain the night before. Each step sank slightly, pulling at my boots, slowing me down. The undergrowth brushed against my pants like fingertips testing boundaries. Somewhere far off, a barred owl called once and then stopped, as if it realized it had said too much. I picked a ridge I'd hunted before. Not often, but enough to remember the lay of the land. A shallow draw cut through the middle with thick oak and hickory on either side. Sound carried strangely there. I'd always chalked it up to terrain. That explanation felt thinner the longer I stood still and listened. When the sky began to lighten, I sat up against a tree and waited. No phone, no music, just breath, pulse, and the faint tick of cooling metal as the morning warmed the barrel of my gun. Time stretched. Every minute felt longer than the last, as if the forest was rationing movement. I made my first soft yelp call just after sunrise. It slid out into the woods and didn't come back. No gobble, no wing beats. Nothing. Silence swallowed it whole. That should have been disappointing. Instead, it was unsettling. Even the bugs seemed hesitant. The usual background noise, the small, constant proof that life was moving, was absent, like a held breath. I told myself turkeys were smart, pressured. Maybe they'd gone quiet. Maybe I was early. Maybe I was just jumpy because the world outside the forest had been shouting fear for months, and it was echoing in my head. I waited longer. The ground grew colder where I sat. My legs started to ache, but I didn't shift. Somewhere to my left, maybe 100 yards downslope, I heard something move. Not footsteps, more like weight being adjusted. A slow drag, then stillness. I froze. Hunters hear things all the time. Deer, hogs, other hunters. You learn to sort sounds quickly, categorize them so they don't rattle you. This one didn't fit neatly. It wasn't light enough to be a turkey, not erratic enough to be a squirrel. Too deliberate. I leaned forward slightly and listened harder. Nothing followed, no retreat, no approach. Just the impression that something had noticed me and decided not to react yet. I waited another 10 minutes before calling again. This time a little louder. The sound carried down the draw, then fractured strangely, breaking into pieces as it hit the far slope. Still no answer. That's when doubt crept in, not fear yet, but the quiet argument you have with yourself when instinct and logic don't agree. I told myself the forest was just empty. I told myself I was wasting a good morning sitting still. I told myself that moving would reset everything. I stood up slowly, muscles stiff, and eased along the ridge, keeping the draw on my right. Every step sounded too loud. Leaves cracked like small bones. My breathing felt amplified as if my chest was hollow. About 50 yards ahead, I saw movement through the trees. Dark. Upright for just a second before slipping behind a trunk. Another hunter, I thought immediately. Relief and irritation tangled together. That would explain the strange quiet. Someone else working the same birds. I raised my hand instinctively, even though I hadn't seen orange. "Hey," I called softly. "Hunter here." The word fell flat. No response. I waited, scanning. Nothing moved. The spot where I'd seen the shape was empty now, the trees exactly as they'd been a second before. I felt foolish for calling out. I kept going, slower now. The draw narrowed and the air felt colder inside it, as if the sun hadn't reached down there yet. The smell changed too. Less green, more rot. Old leaves, water standing longer than it should. I stopped when I reached a small clearing. It wasn't open, exactly, just thinner. A place where storms had taken a few trees and left the rest leaning inward, like an audience. That's where I heard it. A gobble. It came from straight ahead, sharp and clear, close enough to tighten my chest. Real. Close. My pulse jumped, excitement cutting through the unease like a blade. I dropped to a knee, heart pounding, and raised my gun. The gobble came again. Same spot, same distance. Too perfect. I settled against a tree and waited. Minutes passed. The gobble didn't repeat. I made a soft call, barely moving my mouth. Silence. Then another sound. Not a gobble this time. A dry click, like metal tapping wood. My fingers tightened on the stock. That wasn't a turkey. The click came again, closer now. Then a scrape, slow and deliberate, like something being dragged across bark. "Hunter?" I called again, louder this time. Nothing answered. The air felt thicker. My ears strained so hard they hurt. I became aware of everything at once, the weight of the gun, the tightness in my shoulders, the way the forest seemed to be pressing inward, closing distance without moving. I told myself to back out, to circle wide, to put space between me and whatever was ahead. Pride argued back, so did curiosity. I hated that part of myself in that moment, the one that wanted to know instead of be safe. The gobble sounded again. It was wrong. Not the sound itself, the rhythm. Too measured, too even, like someone who had practiced it. My stomach dropped as the realization formed, slow and unwanted. Someone was calling back to me without a call. I raised the gun higher, scanning the trees. That's when I saw it again. A shape, just off to the right this time, taller than it should have been. Still. "Show yourself," I said, and my voice cracked. The shape didn't move. My breath grew shallow. Fear began to bloom, not sudden, but heavy, like water filling a room. I felt watched from more than one direction. The forest no longer felt empty. It felt crowded with things that didn't want to be seen. I don't remember deciding to fire. I remember the pressure building, the certainty that if I didn't act, something else would. When the shotgun went off, the sound shattered the morning, ripping through the trees, echoing down the draw. For half a second, everything was chaos. Recoil, smoke, ringing ears. Then I heard it. Another shot. Same caliber, same distance, same timing, but from the opposite direction. It wasn't an echo. I've hunted long enough to know the difference. Echoes smear sound, stretch it, bend it. This was clean, immediate, a deliberate answer. Panic hit like a physical force. My legs went weak. My mind scrambled for explanations. Another hunter firing at the same time, coincidence, terrain tricks, but none of them held. The timing was too perfect. The direction too precise. Someone had fired back at me. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and ran, crashing through brush, branches tearing at my jacket, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Every step felt off balance, like the ground was shifting under me. Behind me, I heard movement. Not running, keeping pace. I veered uphill, lungs burning, heart hammering so hard it felt like it might split my ribs. The forest blurred. Trees became obstacles instead of landmarks. I lost all sense of direction. Another sound cut through the chaos. A gobble. Right behind me. I screamed then, a raw sound I didn't recognize as my own. I burst through the tree line into the parking area and nearly collapsed against my truck. I fumbled the keys, hands shaking so badly they barely worked. The forest stopped at the edge. No footsteps followed, no sounds at all. Just that sudden, unnatural quiet again, like a door slamming shut. I drove away without looking back. I didn't tell anyone the full story for a long time. Even now, saying it out loud feels like inviting something to listen again. I told myself it was stress, isolation, a trick of sound and fear layered on top of a bad year. But sometimes at night, I still hear it. The way that second shot sounded exactly like mine. Not closer, not farther, perfectly matched. And I know deep down that something in those woods heard me first and answered. The forest was already breathing when I stepped off the service road and into the sand. The kind of breathing you don't hear so much as feel. Slow, wet, patient. Apalachicola National Forest in January doesn't announce itself with birdsong or color. It presses down instead. Pines stretch tall and thin like watchtowers, their needles muting sound, their trunks spaced just far enough apart to make you feel exposed, no matter where you stand. The ground is pale sand layered over dark rot, scarred with hog tracks that look like careless signatures left by something that doesn't worry about being followed. I'd come alone to hunt feral hogs, telling myself I needed the quiet. After a year of noise, arguments, hospitals, phone calls in the middle of the night, I wanted a place that didn't ask questions. The plan was simple. Hike deep, set up a light camp, hunt at dusk and dawn. I trusted my rifle. I trusted my map. What I didn't trust, what I kept pushing down, was the feeling that had started before I even pitched the tent, the sense that this forest didn't want witnesses. By late afternoon, the light thinned into something metallic. I chose a clearing just wide enough to keep sightlines open, though open is relative in a place where palmettos huddle like crouched animals and fallen logs rot into shapes that look intentional. I set my tent near a cluster of scrub pines, back to a shallow depression that might have been a dry creek once. The air smelled faintly of sulfur and stagnant water. Every sound seemed delayed, like the forest was deciding whether to let it travel. I remember rationalizing everything. The quiet meant game nearby. The heaviness was just humidity clinging after rain weeks ago. When the sun finally slipped behind the trees, the temperature dropped fast, and with it came the first movement. Not a sound exactly, more like a pressure change. The brush to my left trembled, then stilled. I froze, listening. Hogs move with weight. You hear them before you see them. This wasn't that. Whatever shifted out there was careful. I cooked quickly, barely tasting the food, eyes sweeping the tree line. Darkness arrived all at once, thick and complete, the kind that erases distance. I zipped the tent and lay back, rifle within reach, headlamp off. That's when the forest began to whisper. It wasn't voices. It was layers of sound stacking wrong. Wind where there shouldn't be wind. A soft, dragging noise, then silence. Something stepped on pine needles with a deliberate crunch, then paused, as if listening to see whether I'd react. My heart kicked hard against my ribs, and I told myself it was hogs circling, curious about scent. Hogs are bold. They'll test you. But hogs snort. They grunt. They argue with each other. This was solitary. The first footsteps came close enough that I felt them through the ground. Heavy. Slow. Not the erratic shuffle of an animal feeding, but the measured pace of something counting distance. It moved clockwise around the tent, stopping every few steps. I tracked it by sound, holding my breath when it paused, letting it out in shallow sips when it moved again. Sand shifted. Palmetto fronds brushed against something solid. I waited for the snort, the huff, the unmistakable sound that would let me name it. Nothing. Denial is a skill you learn early if you want to survive in the woods alone. You don't jump at every shadow. You don't invent threats. I told myself it was a bear, though bears don't move like that here, and January makes them sluggish. I told myself it was a hog big enough to move quietly, though my experience argued otherwise. When the steps stopped directly behind my head, inches from the tent wall, I went completely still. The fabric pressed inward, just slightly, as if something leaned close enough for its weight to register. I smelled earth, sharp and mineral, like fresh dug soil. A breath, not warm, not cold, disturbed the air. My fingers tightened on the rifle stock. I could shoot through the tent. I knew that. The idea lodged in my mind like a splinter. If I shot blind and missed, I'd be advertising weakness. If I hit, I didn't finish that thought. The steps resumed, slower now, wider arc circling again. Hours stretched. My sense of time broke down into heartbeats and sounds. Somewhere far off, an owl called once, then went silent, as if corrected. The forest seemed to lean in with the footsteps, absorbing them, amplifying the weight. At one point, something dragged along the sand, a long, uneven scrape that set my teeth on edge. Not claws, not hooves. It sounded like something heavy being pulled without care. Panic crept in the way cold does, starting at the extremities. My hands shook despite my grip. My mouth went dry. I thought about leaving, bursting out, light blazing, running for the truck. But the idea of turning my back on whatever was out there felt worse than staying still. Trust your instincts, people say. But my instincts were fighting each other. One screamed to flee. The other warned me that movement would trigger something I didn't understand. At some point in the night, exhaustion blurred the edges of fear. I drifted in and out, never fully asleep, jolting awake whenever the steps resumed. They never left. They only changed distance, sometimes far enough that I could almost convince myself it was gone, then close again, so close the tent wall trembled. Once, something brushed the guy line, plucking it like a string. The vibration hummed through the poles. Just before dawn, the footsteps stopped completely. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. No insects, no wind. Even my breathing sounded intrusive. When the sky lightened from black to bruised purple, I forced myself to move. My muscles protested, stiff and cold. I unzipped the tent slowly, rifle up, scanning the clearing. The sand told a story my mind resisted. Around the tent, a wide, smooth track circled again and again, as if something heavy had been dragged deliberately, carving a groove. There were no footprints. No hoof marks. No claw impressions, just the continuous drag, deep enough to expose darker sand beneath, broken only where roots interrupted it. The guy line nearest the back of the tent was frayed, fibers pulled apart like they'd been tested for strength. I stood there longer than I should have, listening to the forest wake back up as if nothing had happened. Birds resumed their calls. Wind sighed through the pines. Everything looked ordinary, except the evidence at my feet and the way my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I broke camp fast, movements sharp and clumsy, every sense stretched thin. As I shouldered my pack, I noticed something else, a shallow depression behind the tent, right where the steps had paused longest. The sand was compacted, pressed down as if something had crouched there, waiting. I didn't hunt that morning. I followed my own tracks out, refusing to look back, every step heavy with the certainty that whatever had circled me hadn't been curious. It had been patient, and patience in a place like that feels a lot like intention. Even now, when I think back on Apalachicola, it isn't the fear that lingers most. It's the lesson I didn't want to learn. That some places don't announce danger with teeth or noise. They watch, they measure. And if you ignore that quiet voice telling you to leave, they'll wait until night when denial is easier and escape feels impossible. In Umpqua National Forest, Oregon, September 2018, I met a man deep in the woods with no rifle, pack, or boots. He warned me not to stay past sunset, then vanished into thick brush. The forest did not announce itself when I crossed the boundary. There was no sign that said I had entered something older than maps, something patient. The trail thinned, the air cooled, and the smell shifted from pine clean to something wet and iron flat, like old leaves pressed under a boot heel. I remember thinking it was a good place to hunt because it felt empty. I wanted empty. I had come to Umpqua to be alone with the sound of my own breath and the clean arithmetic of distance and time. Light left, miles back, weight on my shoulders. I told myself that solitude was the point, that fear had no jurisdiction here. By mid-morning, the canopy tightened. Sunlight fell in narrow coins that slid across the moss and vanished. My boots found a rhythm, leather creaking, gravel answering back. There were no birds. That came later to bother me. The absence. At the time, it felt like luck. Less noise meant better chances. I followed a creek upstream, stepping where the stones were dull with algae, careful not to break the water too hard. The forest leaned in, branches combed my shoulders. I thought of the way a room feels when people stop talking as you enter, how silence can be a kind of attention. The unease didn't come all at once. It arrived in small negotiations. I would hear a sound, twig snap, breath not mine, and explain it away before the thought finished forming. Elk, wind, my own weight shifting. I told myself this was the discipline of the hunt. Recognize, categorize, dismiss. Keep the mind clean. But the dismissals took longer than usual, and when they landed, they left residue. I set up a rough camp in a shallow bowl between ridges, far enough from the creek to avoid damp, but close enough to hear it. A constant hush like someone whispering a secret they'd already told too many times. The ground was springy with needles. I hung my pack, checked my rifle, and ate without hunger. The forest pressed on my ears. Sound stretched thin here. When I snapped a twig between my fingers, it seemed to ring, to travel. It was while I was scanning the tree line, waiting for movement to resolve itself into a body, that I saw him. At first, he was a problem of geometry, a vertical shape where there shouldn't be one, the wrong color for bark. He stood on a slope above the creek, not 10 yards away, so still I wondered how long he'd been there. He was bare to the ankle, no boots. His feet were gray and scarred, the skin thickened and cracked as if he'd been walking like that for a long time. He wore pants torn at the cuffs, a shirt too thin for the shade, and nothing else. No rifle, no pack, no knife I could see. He looked at me like I'd interrupted him. I didn't raise my rifle. I don't know why. My hands knew the weight, the balance, but they stayed low. He was older than I thought at first glance, or maybe younger. The forest does that to faces. His beard was patchy, his eyes bright in a way that felt wrong for someone standing barefoot on stone. He didn't blink. "You shouldn't stay past sunset," he said. His voice was level, not loud. It didn't echo. It didn't need to. I waited for him to say more. The forest waited too. I became aware of my breathing as a separate thing, like a machine I'd left running. "Are you lost?" I asked. It sounded thin. He smiled without showing teeth. "Everyone is." I remember the absurd detail of his feet again, the way dirt had packed under his nails. I remember thinking about hypothermia, about how cold the nights get even in September, about how he must have a camp nearby. The mind will reach for logistics when it can't face implication. "You hunting?" I asked. He shook his head. "I used to." "What are you doing out here without boots?" I said it like a joke, like a challenge. He looked past me, over my shoulder, into the bowl where I'd laid my things. "Waiting," he said, then quieter, "listening." The creek hissed. Something moved high in the canopy, a rush like a sleeve brushed against bark. "Don't stay past sunset," he said again, and this time there was something under it, a pressure that leaned on the words. "It doesn't like being watched at night." "What doesn't?" I asked, and hated myself for it as soon as it left my mouth. He took a step back. The brush swallowed half his body. "You'll hear it," he said. "You'll think it's far. It won't be." And then he was gone, not walking away, not retreating. He turned and the green closed, and there was no sound of him leaving. No crackle of undergrowth, no thud of feet on stone. The place where he'd stood looked exactly like the rest of the forest, as if he had been an error corrected. I stood there for a long time, my mind cataloging the impossible and filing it under coincidence. People live rough. People go barefoot. People say strange things. The forest amplifies it. I told myself that I had let my guard down, that the quiet had made me jumpy. When I finally moved, it was with a stubbornness that felt like courage but wasn't. I went back to my camp. I checked the time. Plenty of daylight. The afternoon dragged. The light shifted in ways that felt intentional, as if something were arranging it. Sounds came and went with a pattern I couldn't map. The creek seemed closer, then farther. Once I thought I heard a footstep behind me. Soft, careful. And when I turned, there was nothing but the shallow bowl and my own breath fogging the air. I laughed out loud, too loud. The sound fell flat. I kept thinking about the word listening, about what it would mean for a place to listen. I found myself lowering my voice when I spoke to no one. I found myself standing still, head tilted, trying to catch the edge of something just beyond hearing. That was when doubt set in, not of what I had seen, but of myself. Had I always been this suggestible? Had the stories finally gotten to me? I thought of past trips, of nights when the dark pressed close and nothing happened. I thought of the discipline of staying put. By the time the light began to yellow, I felt invested. Leaving now would mean admitting that a barefoot stranger had decided my schedule. The idea made me angry. Anger is useful. It sharpens. I told myself I would pack at dusk, that I would be on the trail before true dark. A compromise. The forest does not care about compromises. The first sound came as the sun slipped behind the ridge. It was low, distant, a vibration more than a noise, like a truck idling miles away. I froze. The sound faded. I waited. Nothing. I told myself it was the creek catching the wind, that my ears were playing tricks. I packed deliberately, every motion loud in the thickening quiet. I kept looking up, expecting to see a shape where there shouldn't be one. The second sound was closer. It wasn't an animal call. It didn't have a rhythm. It was a dragging, patient thing, like something being pulled across a surface that didn't want it. I felt it in my teeth. My hands shook. Panic is not a switch, it's a slope. You slide, telling yourself you're still standing. I slung my pack and shouldered my rifle. The trail out felt wrong under my feet. the ground uneven in a way it hadn't been. Shadows pooled where there had been light. The forest had learned me by then. It knew my height, my pace. The sound came again, and this time there was an answering sound to my left, higher, like breath pulled through a narrow space. I broke into a walk that threatened to become a run. Running is a language the forest understands too well. Branches reached, roots grabbed. The dragging sound kept pace without rushing. I thought of the man's feet, gray and scarred. I thought of listening. Something moved parallel to me, unseen, close enough that I could feel the displacement of air. I raised my rifle and aimed at nothing. My finger found the trigger and stayed there. The sound stopped. The sudden absence was worse. In that quiet, I heard my own heart and something else, a faint, wet click, like a tongue against teeth. I don't remember deciding to run. I remember the trail pitching down, my boots skidding, my breath tearing out of me. The forest came alive then, not with the chaos of animals fleeing, but with attention. Leaves whispered. The creek roared suddenly, swollen by proximity. I burst into a clearing I didn't remember, the sky a thin bruise overhead. I tripped and went down hard. The rifle clattered. Pain flared bright and immediate. I rolled and scrambled, hands closing on the stock. In the clearing, something stood at the edge of the trees, not stepping out, not needing to. It was tall in a way that defied measure, its outline wrong, as if the darkness had learned to stand. I could not make out a face. I did not want to. The sound came from it then, and from everywhere, a chorus of that dragging patience. The breath pulled tight. I understood in a way that bypassed thought that it had been listening to me all day, to my steps, to my heartbeat, to the lies I told myself. I fired. The sound cracked the night open. The recoil slammed into my shoulder. The flash lit nothing that I could hold on to. The forest swallowed the noise, corrected itself. The shape did not move. The sound changed, sharpened, pleased. I ran again, screaming now. The sound ripped out of me without permission. The trail appeared under my feet like a gift I didn't deserve. I followed it blind, branches cutting my face, my pack banging. I did not look back. I did not listen. The forest chased me with restraint like a hand held inches from my spine. The parking lot was a rectangle of gray salvation. I burst into it and didn't stop until I hit the truck, hands scrabbling for the door. I threw myself inside and locked it, the click loud as a gunshot. I sat there shaking, lungs on fire, staring at the tree line. Nothing came out. The forest withdrew, polite again. I drove without headlights for the first mile, afraid of what they might show. When I finally turned them on, the road was empty, the world ordinary and cruel in its normalcy. I did not slow until the trees thinned and the sky opened. I still hunt. I still walk into places that don't care if I come back. But I leave before sunset now. I listen differently. When the forest goes quiet, I don't take it as luck. I take it as attention. And sometimes when the ground feels springy with needles and the air smells like ironed leaves, I think of bare feet on stone and a voice that didn't need to echo. At dawn in Coconino National Forest, Arizona, December 2020, a mule deer stood motionless, staring straight at me for minutes. When it finally moved, it walked backward into the trees. The cold had already sunk into my bones long before the sun considered showing itself. Not the sharp, honest cold of snowstorms back home, but a dry, creeping chill that slipped through layers and settled into joints, the kind that made time feel heavier. I remember thinking the forest was too quiet, not peaceful, empty, like a room after an argument when the air still remembers what was said. I had been hiking since well before dawn, boots crunching softly against frost-stiffened needles. Every step felt deliberate, careful, as if the ground itself might react if I moved too fast. My breath rose in pale clouds that vanished almost immediately, swallowed by the trees. Ponderosa pines towered above me, their trunks straight and indifferent, bark flaking like old scars. Somewhere far off, a raven called once, then fell silent. No wind, no birds waking up, just that sound, and then nothing. I told myself that silence meant opportunity. Hunters learn to love quiet. Quiet means animals are close. Quiet means the forest hasn't noticed you yet. I repeated that thought like a prayer, even as something in my chest tightened, a pressure that didn't feel like excitement. It felt like being watched without proof. I reached a small clearing just as the sky began to pale, that thin gray blue that comes before color. That's when I saw the mule deer. It stood at the far edge of the clearing, partially framed by trees, body angled toward me. Big buck, tall ears, thick winter coat, perfect silhouette. I froze instinctively, easing my weight back, careful not to let gravel betray me. This was the moment hunters wait for: stillness, alignment, patience. But the deer didn't flinch, its ears didn't twitch, its head didn't tilt. It didn't stamp or snort or bolt like prey is supposed to. It just stared at me. At first I counted seconds, slow and methodical like I'd been trained. 5, 10, 20. My breathing grew shallow. My fingers tightened around my rifle stock, then loosened. I didn't raise the weapon. Something about the way the deer held itself felt wrong. Not alert, not curious. Intent. Its eyes were dark, glassy, fixed directly on my face. Not my outline, not my movement. Me. I shifted my foot slightly, testing reality, and the sound echoed too loudly in my head. The deer didn't react. Its chest rose and fell, slow and steady, like it had all the time in the world. A minute passed, then another. My thoughts began to scatter. Maybe it was sick. Maybe it was injured. Maybe the wind was wrong and it hadn't caught my scent yet. I clung to explanations because the alternative, that something unnatural was happening, felt ridiculous, childish. Hunters don't panic over deer. Hunters don't assign meaning to animal behavior beyond instinct. But instinct was exactly what was screaming at me now. The forest seemed to lean inward, the edges of my vision narrowing. The cold intensified, not dropping in temperature, but changing character, becoming oppressive, like the air had weight. I realized I hadn't heard my own breath in several seconds. Everything inside me had gone very still. Then the deer moved. It didn't turn. It didn't step sideways. It walked backward. One slow step at a time, hooves placing themselves with deliberate care, never breaking eye contact. Its body slid into the shadow line of the trees, swallowed inch by darkness, until only its face remained visible between two trunks. For a heartbeat, maybe longer, it stayed there, eyes locked on mine, and then it was gone. The clearing felt instantly wrong, like a stage after the actors leave, but the spotlight stays on. My skin prickled. I became acutely aware of my pulse, loud and uneven in my ears. I stood there longer than I should have, rifle half raised, waiting for something, anything, to confirm that what I just witnessed had a normal explanation. Nothing came. I told myself to keep moving. Standing still after something unsettling is how fear grows teeth. Movement restores order. That's what I believed anyway. I pushed deeper into the forest, angling toward a ridge I'd marked on my map, every sense sharpened to an uncomfortable degree. The crunch of my boots sounded amplified. The brush of my jacket against branches felt intrusive, almost rude. As the light strengthened, the forest should have woken up. Birds should have announced the morning. Squirrels should have scolded me from above. Instead, the silence followed me, unbroken like a held breath. Even the wind seemed reluctant, only whispering when I stopped, then fading when I moved, as if reacting to me rather than the other way around. I tried to laugh it off once, a short breath through my nose. The sound died immediately, absorbed by the trees. It didn't echo. It didn't travel. It just vanished. That was when doubt began to take root. I'd hunted these forests before. Different seasons, different years. I knew the rhythms, the way sound carried, the way animals moved. This felt off-pattern, like listening to a song where every note is just slightly wrong. My rational mind worked overtime, cataloging facts, dismissing superstition, yet my body refused to cooperate. My shoulders stayed tight, my jaw ached from clenching. Every time I paused, I felt exposed, like something was closing distance when I wasn't looking. I reached a narrow ravine where the ground dipped sharply, rocks slick with frost. As I descended, the air grew colder, denser. The smell changed. Less pine, more damp earth, and something metallic, faint but unmistakable. Blood, maybe, or rust. I slowed, scanning for tracks. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were deer tracks at first glance, but the spacing was wrong, too even, too measured, as if whatever made them had walked with intention rather than urgency. They led down the ravine and then reversed. Not turned around, reversed. The hooves faced me. A surge of panic rose in my throat before I could stop it. My mind replayed the image of the deer backing into the trees, eyes never leaving mine. A memory layered on top of a pattern, evidence forcing truth. I felt stupid for being afraid of tracks, of impressions in dirt. But fear doesn't ask permission. It builds quietly, brick by brick, until suddenly you're standing inside it, walls too high to see over. I became convinced I wasn't alone, not in the vague way people say when they're uneasy, but with certainty, sharp and undeniable. The sensation pressed against my spine, a cold finger tracing vertebrae. I started moving faster, careful but no longer leisurely, rifle held ready. My heart hammered, each beat echoing too loudly in my chest. A sound came then, not from behind me, but ahead. Soft, rhythmic, like footsteps matching mine, but delayed by half a second. I stopped. The sound stopped. I took a step. It followed. I whispered hello before I could stop myself, my voice thin and useless. No answer, just the forest, listening. Panic threatened to take over, a tidal force crashing against restraint. I turned, scanning, spinning too quickly, breath ragged, trees blurred together, every shadow looked deeper than it should have been. I realized with a jolt that I didn't remember choosing this direction. The ravine had twisted my sense of orientation. The map in my pocket suddenly felt inadequate, a child's drawing compared to the vastness around me. The footsteps grew closer, not louder, closer. I broke into a jog, then a run, branches slapping my arms, breath tearing at my lungs. Fear stripped away thought, leaving only instinct. Get out. Get back. Distance mattered more than dignity. I didn't look behind me. I couldn't. The certainty that something would be there felt unbearable. I burst into another clearing, skidded to a stop, nearly falling. The sun had finally breached the tree line, casting long skeletal shadows across the ground. For a split second, relief surged. Light meant safety, meant normalcy. And there it was again. The mule deer stood at the opposite edge, closer this time. Its head tilted slightly, an almost curious gesture. Its chest rose and fell. Calm, unafraid, waiting. I raised the rifle, hands shaking violently now. The scope wobbled, refusing to settle. Through the glass, the deer's eye filled my vision, black and reflective, impossibly deep. I hesitated, finger tightening, then loosening. Shooting felt wrong, not morally, viscerally, like pulling the trigger would be an invitation rather than a defense. The deer took a single step backward. That was enough. I lowered the rifle and ran. I don't remember the path clearly, only fragments, stumbling over roots, tearing my glove on bark, the burn in my lungs as air refused to come fast enough. Sounds chased me, footsteps, branches snapping, my name whispered in a voice that might have been memory or imagination. Time lost meaning, distance blurred. When I finally broke through the tree line near my truck, I collapsed against the door, shaking so hard my teeth rattled. The forest behind me stood still, sunlit and ordinary, offering no evidence of what it had held. I drove away without looking back. Later, much later, when my hands had steadied and daylight felt trustworthy again, I tried to explain it all away. Stress, isolation, cold. But some moments resist explanation. They lodge themselves deep, changing the shape of your thoughts. I still hunt. I still love the wild. But I no longer believe the forest is passive. Sometimes it watches. Sometimes it tests you. And sometimes at dawn, it sends something to see whether you notice when the rules stop applying. I noticed. And that noticing, that awareness, has followed me ever since, quiet as frost underfoot, reminding me that not everything that looks like prey is meant to be pursued, and not every retreat is a loss. While elk hunting in Lolo National Forest, Montana, October 2023, my radio crackled to life with frantic breathing. The channel was empty, and my partner was miles away. The frost hadn't melted yet when I stepped off the game trail and into the timber. It clung to the deadfall like a second skin, pale and brittle, crunching softly under my boots. Every sound felt too loud in the thin morning air. The scrape of bark against my sleeve, the slow click of my rifle sling shifting on my shoulder, my own breathing pushing white ghosts into the trees. I remember thinking how quiet it was, not peaceful quiet, but the kind that feels deliberate, as if the forest has decided to listen instead of speak. I had been hunting elk for years, long enough to trust routines more than instincts. Long enough to believe that if you plan carefully, mark your waypoints, check your wind, and keep your head, the woods will let you pass through without incident. That belief carried me deeper into Lolo National Forest that morning, past the last place where my partner's boot tracks faded into needle-covered soil, past the ridge where our radios still talked clearly to each other. By mid-morning, the terrain changed. The slopes steepened, the trees packed closer, and the light thinned into long gray strands that barely touched the ground. Sound changed too. It didn't echo anymore. It sank. My footsteps felt swallowed before they finished landing. I told myself it was normal. Thick timber does that. But the silence pressed in all the same, heavy and damp, like something laid across my chest. I stopped to glass a small clearing, the kind elk like to cut through when they're moving from feed to cover. Nothing. No movement. No birds. Even the wind seemed to hesitate, brushing the treetops but never quite reaching the forest floor. I checked my radio out of habit, thumbed the button lightly. "Still hunting North Slope," I said. My own voice startled me. Too sharp. Too clean. Static answered, thin and brief. Then nothing. I kept moving, angling toward a finger ridge we'd marked the night before. The farther I went, the more I felt the weight of the place. Not fear exactly, but a resistance, like the forest didn't want me there and hadn't yet decided how to make that clear. I found myself listening harder than usual, not for elk, but for anything that would confirm I wasn't alone with my own thoughts. The first sound that didn't belong was faint enough I almost ignored it. A breath, I thought, wind through a broken trunk. I stood still, heart ticking faster than the seconds. The sound came again, softer this time, close enough that I turned slowly, scanning the trees behind me. Nothing. I waited, counting my breaths, feeling the cold creep through my gloves. When nothing else happened, I shook it off and moved on, annoyed at myself for letting imagination fill the gaps. That's how it starts out there. Not with panic, but with denial dressed up as experience. An hour later, I cut fresh tracks. Elk moving downhill. The sign was good enough to pull my focus back where it belonged. I slowed, eased each step, letting the hunt settle my nerves. The forest felt different when I had a purpose. Narrower, more manageable. That was when my radio crackled. At first, it was just static, sharp, and sudden in my ear. I flinched, then smiled at the reflex. My partner must have climbed to higher ground. I lifted the radio, already forming a reply. Before I could speak, breathing filled the channel. Not wind, not movement. Breathing, ragged, uneven, close. Each inhale sounded wet, like air being dragged through something tight. Each exhale trembled, breaking halfway out, as if whoever was on the other end couldn't quite finish it. I froze. "Mark," I said, pressing the button. My voice came out low, controlled, the way you talk when you don't want to scare someone. "Mark, you all right?" The breathing continued. Faster now. No words, no background noise. Just breath, filling my ear like the person was right beside the mic, lips almost touching it. I checked the channel. Ours. The one we'd agreed on. No one else should have been on it for miles. "Mark, talk to me," I said. The breathing hitched. For a moment I thought I heard something else layered beneath it. A faint clicking, or maybe teeth knocking together. Then the transmission cut off. Silence slammed back into place, thicker than before. I stood there longer than I realized, staring at the radio like it might explain itself. My first instinct was to move toward him, to close the distance, but a second thought crept in, colder and quieter. The breathing hadn't sounded like someone running. It hadn't sounded like injury either. It sounded wrong, too close, too intimate, as if the forest itself had leaned in to speak through the radio. I told myself it was panic on his end. Altitude, exertion, a stumble. Radios distort sound, fear fills in blanks. Every explanation felt thinner than the last. I tried him again, no response. I turned back the way I'd come, choosing a line that would keep me high, where reception was better. As I moved, the woods seemed to tighten around me. Branches snagged my pack. Deadfall shifted underfoot with sharp cracks that made my shoulders jump. I kept expecting to hear something behind me, footsteps, breath, but there was nothing. Just the sound of my own pulse, loud and insistent in my ears. Halfway up the slope, the breathing came back. It burst through the radio without warning, louder this time, almost frantic. There was a wetness to it now, a gurgling undertone that made my stomach twist. "Mark, say something," I said, louder than before. "Where are you?" The breathing stuttered, then stopped so abruptly it felt like someone had covered the mic with a hand. Then a sound came through that I still can't fully describe. Not a word, not a scream. More like an attempt at speech that failed halfway, collapsing into a low, shuddering noise that vibrated through the speaker and into my jaw. I felt my instincts finally push past my training. Every part of me wanted to run, but running in steep timber with a loaded rifle is how people die. So I moved faster instead, controlled but urgent, putting ground behind me while my eyes tracked every shadow. The forest began to sound wrong. My footsteps echoed when they shouldn't have. A branch snapped uphill, then another downhill, too spaced out to be natural. I spun slowly, trying to map the sounds to make them fit into something logical. They didn't. I broke into a small drainage choked with alder and moss. The air down there was colder, heavier, carrying a smell like wet iron. As I crossed, the radio crackled again, but this time there was no breathing, just a low hum, steady and deep, like pressure building. Then, clear as day, my own voice came through the speaker. "Still hunting North Slope," the exact words I'd said hours earlier. Same tone, same cadence. Stripped of warmth and replayed back at me like a recording found in the wrong place. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped the radio. "No," I said out loud to myself, to the trees, to whatever was listening. "That's not possible." The hum cut out. Silence rushed back in, roaring in my ears. I didn't think anymore. I moved, up the far bank, through brush that tore at my sleeves, back toward the ridge where we'd last checked in together. My breath came hard now, burning my chest, fogging my vision. The forest felt alive in a way I'd never experienced, not moving, not chasing, just watching, waiting. When I hit the ridge, the wind finally found me. It came hard from the west, carrying the familiar smell of pine and cold stone. I forced myself to stop, to breathe, to get control. Panic would only make it worse. I tried the radio one last time. Nothing. No static. No hum. Dead. I didn't see my partner until I was almost on top of him. His pack lay where he'd dropped it, rifle propped against a tree like he'd stepped away for a moment and planned to come right back. There were tracks, his circling the area in uneven loops, pressed deep into the soil as if he'd been pacing, or worse, turning without direction. There was no blood, no sign of a struggle, just the sense something had been interrupted and left unfinished. I waited there longer than I should have, calling his name until my voice broke, listening for an answer that never came. The forest gave nothing back. Not even the silence felt honest anymore. I hiked out as darkness crept in, every shadow stretching into something taller, every sound sharp enough to cut. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. When I finally reached the truck, my hands were numb and my throat raw from breathing air that felt too thin to trust. They found him 2 days later, miles from where he should have been, in a place that made no sense for the route he'd planned. No injuries they could explain. No radio on him. I don't hunt that forest anymore. Sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and my thoughts wander where they shouldn't, I swear I can still hear that breathing, ragged, close, waiting for me to answer. The cold that morning wasn't sharp, it was heavy, like something pressing down on my chest. Snow lay in layers, not clean and white, but dulled by old storms and wind, compacted into a skin that squeaked under my boots. Every breath tasted of iron and pine sap. I had been hunting alone in White Mountain National Forest for 3 days by then, pushing deeper each morning, following sign that felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. I told myself it was winter paranoia. February always messes with your head up there. The forest grows quieter, tighter. Sound doesn't travel the same. It folds in on itself. Even the birds seemed reluctant to speak. I was tracking a large animal, at least that's what logic insisted. The prints were inconsistent, sometimes deer-like, sometimes too deep, too wide. I'd rationalized it as overlapping trails. Elk had been rumored farther north, maybe a moose passing through higher elevation. My mind kept trying to tidy the facts, sweep the unease under a rug of experience. I'd been hunting most of my adult life. I knew how fear felt when it made sense. This wasn't that. By mid-morning, the sky turned that flat, metallic gray that kills depth perception. Trees blurred into one another, trunks repeating like bars in a cage. I noticed then that the forest floor had changed. The snow was disturbed more violently, scuffed, churned, torn apart as if something heavy had struggled there. Not a kill site. No drag marks, just chaos. I slowed, every step deliberate. My ears strained for something, anything. But the silence pressed harder, thick as wool. Even my own movements felt muted, as if the forest were swallowing sound before it could escape. That's when I saw the blood. It wasn't on the ground, it was sprayed across the trunks. Dark, dried crimson streaks, frozen in mid-motion, splattered high, 10 feet above the snow line. Some stains angled upward, others curved, as if flung with force and momentum. It wasn't pooled. It wasn't smeared. It was thrown. I stood there longer than I should have, my breath fogging the scope of my rifle. My brain immediately reached for explanations. A wounded animal leaping, maybe colliding with branches. But there were no broken limbs, no snapped twigs at that height. And the pattern wasn't random. It had direction. Something had bled violently while upright. The realization crept in slow, like frostbite. I felt it first in my stomach, a hollowing, then in my hands, which had begun to shake despite my gloves. I remember whispering, no, not to the forest, but to myself. Denial is quieter than fear, but more stubborn. I followed the blood. That decision still haunts me, not because it was reckless, but because it felt inevitable. As if, once I'd seen it, the forest had already decided I would keep going. The trail led uphill, the slope steepening, the trees thinning into jagged clusters of spruce and fir. Wind hissed through the needles, creating a sound like distant breathing. My footsteps echoed oddly, delayed, as if someone else were walking behind me, half a second out of sync. I stopped twice, convinced I heard movement. Each time, nothing revealed itself. No snapped branch, no displaced snow. Just the sensation of being observed, not watched, but measured. The blood thinned, then vanished altogether. In its place, the tracks changed. Whatever I had been following no longer moved like an animal. The stride lengthened unnaturally. Imprints pressed deep at the heel, lighter at the toe, as if weight distribution had shifted. I knelt to examine one, my knee sinking into the snow, cold seeping through fabric. My fingers traced the edge of the print before I could stop myself. It was wrong, too narrow, too defined. I stood up too fast, heart hammering, and scanned the trees. My pulse roared in my ears, drowning out the wind. The forest felt closer now, trunks leaning in, branches sagging under old snow like bowed heads. That's when doubt finally cracked through my denial. I wasn't tracking something that had bled. I was tracking something that had survived. The temperature dropped sharply as clouds thickened. Light dimmed until everything took on the same bluish cast, depth flattening, distances lying. I checked my GPS. Signal was weak. I was farther in than planned, but still within my mental map. I told myself to turn back after the ridge, just reach the ridge, get a vantage point, then decide. That was another lie I told myself. As I climbed, the sounds changed. The wind died, replaced by a low, intermittent creak, trees shifting, I thought. But it had rhythm, not regular, not random, like something adjusting its weight. I froze. The creak stopped. Silence slammed back into place so abruptly it felt like pressure in my skull. I became acutely aware of my own breathing, the rasp of it loud and obscene. I forced myself to slow it, every inhale measured. Then I heard it. A sound behind me, not footsteps, not movement. A wet exhale dragged through a throat that didn't quite know how to shape it. Close enough that I could feel it more than hear it, a vibration in the air. I didn't turn. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but another, older instinct locked my muscles in place. Predators chase what flees. Prey that freezes sometimes buys time. Snow crunched softly, closer. I could smell it now. Iron and rot and something sharp like ozone after lightning. My fingers tightened around my rifle, knuckles aching. I counted breaths, seconds stretching, waiting for contact that never came. Instead, the sound retreated, not hurried, not alarmed, curious. That was when panic finally broke through fear. I ran. Branches tore at my jacket, whipping my face as I barreled downhill, no longer caring about noise or direction. My lungs burned, cold air slicing deep. The forest seemed to tilt, trees blurring past, shadows lunging in my peripheral vision. I slipped once, catching myself on a trunk streaked with blood. Fresh this time, still wet. I didn't stop. I burst into a small clearing I didn't recognize, heart threatening to tear itself free. In the center stood something I hadn't noticed before, a crude structure of fallen branches lashed together, half buried in snow. Not a shelter, not a blind, a marker. Something had been left there. Not meat, not tools, just bones. Cleaned, arranged deliberately, set upright against the wood like offerings or warnings. Human bones. My scream never made it out of my throat. Behind me, snow crunched again. I spun, rifle raised, finger squeezing. Nothing. The clearing was empty. The trees stood silent, unmoving, as if they had never leaned closer, never watched. The sound was gone, the smell dissipating into cold air. I backed away slowly, every step careful, eyes never leaving the tree line. My mind fractured into competing thoughts. Hallucination, hypothermia, coincidence, but none of them fit the blood. None explained the height, the pattern, the bones. I turned and ran again, this time with direction born of desperation. I followed my own tracks where I could find them, stumbling, falling, dragging myself upright. Dusk crept in fast, shadows pooling, swallowing detail. The forest fought me the whole way. Snow deepened, slopes steepened. Sounds multiplied, cracks, sighs, whispers just beyond comprehension. Once, I thought I heard my name, distorted, dragged through the trees in a voice that wasn't quite human. By the time I reached my truck, darkness had fully claimed the woods. I slammed the door shut, hands shaking so badly I dropped my keys twice. When the engine finally turned over, the sound felt blasphemously loud. I didn't look back. I drove all night, not stopping until the sun rose and the mountains fell away behind me. I told no one what I'd seen. Not the blood, not the bones, not the sound of breathing where no body stood. Officially, I ended the hunt early due to weather. Unofficially, I've never gone back, because sometimes in winter, when the world grows quiet and sound folds inward, I still hear it. The forest breathing, patient and curious, remembering the shape of me. The forest didn't greet me when I stepped beneath its canopy. It swallowed me. Pisgah in late August carries a particular weight, thick, wet, pressing against the skin like a held breath. The air tasted green and metallic, the kind of taste you only notice when you stop talking and start listening. I had come alone to scout for elk sign, a quiet trip meant to clear my head after months of noise, screens, and people. I told myself solitude was the point. I told myself the silence would be clean. But silence in Pisgah is never empty. It's layered. Cicadas ticking like faulty wiring, leaves whispering to one another in a language just below comprehension. Far-off water tumbling over rock, a steady reminder of depth and drop. Every sound had direction, distance, intention. The forest felt aware of me, not hostile yet, but attentive, the way a crowd quiets when someone steps onto a stage. I followed an old game trail along the valley wall, boots sinking into damp loam. The ground was soft enough to hold track, too churned with deer and bear sign to tell me much. I moved slowly, deliberately, the way you do when you're hunting sign rather than animals. Head down, mind half elsewhere, instincts working without words. Every now and then I'd stop and listen, letting my breathing slow to match the woods. That was when the first unease crept in. Not fear, not yet, just a subtle resistance, a sense that my body was listening harder than my mind. I ignored it. I'd spent years learning not to spook myself. I'd hunted in thicker, darker places. I knew how the imagination feeds on quiet. So when I felt that prickle between my shoulder blades, I labeled it nerves and kept moving. The valley opened wider as the afternoon wore on. Ferns rose waist-high, slick and bright, brushing my legs as I passed. The light filtered down in broken shards, turning everything green gold and unreal, like the world was being viewed through old glass. I marked a potential camp near a bend in the creek, flat ground, good water, enough tree cover to stay hidden. Something about that spot felt heavy, like it had been used too often by too many things, but I pushed the thought aside. Dusk came quickly. One moment the forest was merely dim, the next it felt bruised. Shadows stretched and merged, erasing depth. The temperature dropped just enough to make sweat on my back turn cold. I checked my watch and told myself I had time to circle back before dark settled fully. That was when the sound came. At first, it was distant enough to be mistaken for wind funneling through rock, a long, wavering note rising from the valley floor. It threaded through the trees, bending around trunks, slipping under leaves. My brain searched for categories. Wind, animal, human voice. It didn't fit any of them. It rose again, louder this time, and the wrongness of it made my stomach tighten. It sounded human, but stretched, broken, as if someone had taken a scream and pulled it thin. The pitch wavered unnaturally, dipping too low, climbing too high, like a voice forgetting how to be a voice. I froze. The forest froze with me. The insects fell silent so abruptly it felt like pressure in my ears. Even the creek seemed to hush, its sound flattening into a dull murmur. All that remained was that scream, echoing off the valley walls, folding back on itself. I remember thinking, someone's hurt. Someone needs help. I also remember how fast that thought was followed by another, quieter one. Don't move. Those two instincts collided inside me, grinding against each other. I told myself it was a hiker who'd fallen, maybe someone panicking, their voice warped by distance and terrain. I told myself Pisgah wasn't some untouched wilderness. People got lost here all the time. But the scream came again, closer now, and it wasn't a call for help. There was no rhythm to it, no breath pattern. It didn't rise and fall the way lungs demand. It just went. Too long, too sustained. As if whatever was making the sound didn't need to stop. My hands were shaking before I noticed. I crouched instinctively, lowering my profile, every sense straining outward. I tried to pinpoint direction, but the sound moved strangely, bouncing in ways that made the valley feel deeper than it was. It could have been below me. It could have been behind. The third scream cut off abruptly, snapping the silence back into place like a trap. I waited, counted breaths, listened. Nothing. That was worse. Fear didn't hit all at once. It leaked in, slow and cold, seeping through the cracks in my rationalizations. My mind kept offering explanations. Bobcat, fox, auditory illusion. But my body rejected them. My pulse was too fast, my skin too tight. The forest felt closer, the trees subtly leaning inward, as if the valley were narrowing around me. I stood and started moving uphill, away from the sound, careful not to rush. Panic makes noise. Panic gets you hurt. I placed each foot deliberately, but the ground betrayed me. Roots slick with moss, leaves hiding dips. Every stumble spiked my heart, sent adrenaline flooding my limbs. Halfway up the slope, the scream returned. It came from above me this time. The sound tore through the trees, so close I felt it in my chest. It wasn't loud in the way explosions are loud. It was loud in the way proximity is loud, filling space rather than volume. I spun, scanning the darkening woods, my light still clipped uselessly to my pack. That was when I smelled it. Not rot, not musk, something sharp and sour, like wet fur and iron. It drifted past me in a warm pocket of air, deliberate, invasive. My stomach dropped. I broke into a run. Branches whipped my arms, leaves slapped my face. The forest that had felt heavy now felt aggressive, every obstacle placed with intent. The scream chased me, not constantly, but intermittently. erupting without warning, each time closer, each time more distorted. I could hear movement now, too. Footfalls that didn't match mine, heavier, uneven, stopping when I stopped. I told myself not to look back. I looked back. The beam of my headlamp caught nothing solid. Just motion, a suggestion of height between the trees, shadows folding into shadows. But something reflected the light briefly, low and wide, before vanishing. That was when panic finally took over, raw and undeniable. My breath tore in and out of my chest, my vision narrowing. The world reduced itself to ground and direction. Downhill, toward the creek, toward water and open space. I crashed into the valley floor hard enough to knock the wind from me. Pain flared up my leg, sharp and hot, but I didn't stop to check it. The scream erupted again, so close now it felt like it was inside my skull, vibrating my teeth. I scrambled to my feet and ran, boots splashing through shallow water, stones slick beneath me. The creek widened ahead, moonlight glinting off its surface. I burst from the trees and stumbled into the open, turning, screaming back into the dark without meaning to. My voice sounded small, fragile. The forest answered with silence. I stood there shaking, chest heaving, every muscle locked, waiting for something, anything, to step into the light. Nothing did. I didn't camp that night. I didn't even stop moving until the trailhead lights came into view hours later, my body running on something deeper than adrenaline. I drove until dawn, hands numb on the wheel, the sound of that scream replaying itself in my head, each time slightly different, slightly closer. Weeks passed before I could sleep without dreaming of valleys that bent sound and shadows that learned my name. Even now, when dusk settles too quickly and the air grows thick, I hear echoes that aren't there. Pisgah still stands. People still hike its trails, pitch tents by its creeks, tell stories around fires. But I know what it can hold in its voice when the light breaks wrong. And I know better now than to mistake silence for safety. The forest didn't greet me when I stepped in. It swallowed me. By late afternoon, the light had already begun thinning, stretched into pale ribbons between the trunks. Monongahela National Forest has a way of doing that, of stealing daylight quietly, like a pickpocket who never bumps into you. I remember thinking how sound behaved differently there. My boots didn't crunch the way they should have. The leaves were damp, but not wet, as if the ground itself was holding its breath. I was alone by design. That mattered to me then. I'd told myself solitude sharpened instincts, stripped distractions away. I had hunted alone before, elk in Colorado, hogs in Texas, even a long winter bow season in Montana. But this place felt older, heavier. The forest didn't just surround me, it leaned. Every step deeper carried the faint impression of trespass. Not the normal kind, no fences, no signs, but the feeling you get when you realize you're walking through a room where a conversation just stopped. I dismissed it. That's what hunters do. We rationalize. We call unease adrenaline and keep moving. The campsite sat in a shallow basin ringed by black birch and red spruce. No wind reached it. Smoke from my fire rose straight up and dissolved into the canopy, like the forest was inhaling it. I set my pack down and listened, not for animals, for pattern. There were none. No insects cheering in layers, no distant birds settling in for the night, just silence that pressed against my ears until I noticed my own breathing felt too loud, almost intrusive. I told myself it was seasonal. Late spring anomalies, the kind of thing you'd explain away to keep your mind steady. As dusk came on, the light dimmed in uneven pulses. One moment the clearing felt open, the next it shrank, as though the trees had edged closer while I blinked. I cooked quickly and ate without appetite, eyes tracking the tree line without consciously meaning to. Shadows didn't behave normally. They pooled, thickened, then slid away when I focused on them. That was when the sound came. A single, hollow knock, not sharp like wood on wood, not the crack of a falling branch. It was rounded, resonant, like someone hitting a tree with the flat of their palm. I froze mid-bite. The sound echoed, but not outward. It seemed to fold back on itself, swallowed by the trees. I waited. 10 seconds. 20. My pulse ticked in my throat. Another knock followed, same tone, same depth. Closer, I thought, but that was probably imagination. Sound travels strange in dense woods. I'd lectured others about that exact thing. I stood and walked to the edge of camp, heart steady but alert. I scanned with my light. Nothing reflected back but bark and leaf. No eyes, no movement. Then, without planning it, without even realizing I was deciding, I knocked back. Once. Hard. The sound I made felt small the instant it left my knuckles, like I'd thrown a pebble into a canyon. The answer came immediately. 3 knocks. 3 directions. Left, right, behind me. They weren't echoes. They were distinct, staggered just enough to register as separate origins. My chest tightened so fast it hurt. The forest no longer felt quiet. It felt attentive. I swung the light around, beam cutting white tunnels through the dark. The trees stood unmoving, their bark swallowing the light instead of reflecting it. My breath came faster now, thin and high. I told myself there had to be hikers, maybe locals messing around. Appalachian traditions. Wood knocks. Call and response. That explanation fit just well enough to keep panic at bay. I packed up camp in silence, hands clumsy. Every sound I made suddenly obscene. Fabric rasped too loud. Metal clinked like a drop bell. I kept expecting another knock. It didn't come. That was worse. I chose not to hike out. That decision still haunts me. Pride had a hand in it. So did exhaustion. Mostly, though, it was denial. Leaving felt like admitting something I wasn't ready to name. When full dark settled, the forest changed texture. The air thickened, smells sharpened. Wet soil, iron-rich water, something faintly sour that reminded me of old leaves crushed too many times. My headlamp felt inadequate, its beam swallowed within 10 feet. Then the footsteps began, not mine, slow, deliberate, always stopping when I stopped, starting again when I moved. They never circled closer, never retreated. They paced me, just beyond the reach of light. I called out. My voice sounded wrong, flattened, stripped of echo. No answer came, but the footsteps adjusted, repositioning, like whatever made them had learned my cadence. The fear didn't hit all at once. It crept. First doubt, then the creeping realization that I was no longer reacting to the forest. I was negotiating with it. I tried logic again. Deer, bears, even people, but the steps were too measured, too evenly spaced, and they never snapped a twig. I backed toward the trail, boots sliding on leaves that suddenly felt slick, treacherous. My mouth tasted metallic. Every nerve in my body buzzed with the certainty that if I ran, something would run with me and do it better. That's when the knocking returned. Closer now, louder. Not from trees this time, but from within the darkness itself, like the sound was carried on breath instead of air. I didn't knock back again. I turned and ran. The forest erupted. Not with sound, but with motion. Shadows surged. Branches snagged my pack, my sleeves, my skin. The trail dissolved beneath my feet, replaced by uneven ground that pitched and dipped without warning. My light bounced wildly, showing me fragments, bark too smooth, roots like fingers, a flash of pale between trunks that vanished when I screamed. The footsteps chased me now, multiple sets, surrounding, closing. The knocking followed, overlapping faster, like something mocking the rhythm of my heart. I burst into a clearing I didn't recognize and collapsed, lungs burning, vision tunneling. The knock stopped. The footsteps faded. Silence returned, but it wasn't empty anymore. It was full, saturated. I lay there until dawn, afraid to sleep, afraid to move. When morning finally came, the forest looked normal again, almost gentle. But the trees leaned just a little closer than before. I left without packing properly. I didn't look back. Some places don't chase you to kill you. Some just want you to answer back once, so they know your voice. And once they do, they never forget it.